So for the last 3 or 4 weeks, we have been making our way through a study on the life of David. And in doing so, we've commented that David was commended by God himself as a man after God's own heart, who would be, according to the book of Acts, willing to do all of God's will. And it has been, and I hope it will continue to be, an informative and encouraging study as we consider different parts of his life, as we consider different episodes from his journey. There's quite a bit written about David. Some scholars estimate outside of God himself and Jesus, there's more written about David than any other character, or he's referenced more. So there's quite a bit to learn from. I'm really glad that Josh had the opportunity last Wednesday night to walk us through David and Goliath. We were down in Southern California. Just so everybody knows, we were also remaining safe, being aware of other people and being careful and cautious even as we visited family. But I had the opportunity to tune in, and I was glad we did. I love the story of David and Goliath because there's so much to learn, not only about the episode itself and this famous passage that we start teaching our kids when they're really young, but then even as we grow older as adults, we recognize there's so much to be gleaned from that. And Josh had never taught through it in a church setting, and so we were excited that he had the opportunity to do that. I think that everybody who does ministry or is involved in Bible studies here or there or wherever should always take up any opportunity they have to walk through the David and Goliath passage, because God meets us there and encourages us there. That as the people who desire to live after God's own heart and do all of his will, there's so much to be learned from those moments. Well, tonight we're gonna pick up in David's life shortly after the David and Goliath episode. So if you're at home and you have access to the Bible, or you have a Bible lying around, go ahead and grab that. If you're in here, we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 18 to begin with. We'll probably jump all the way around. If you're in the room, I don't know if you can see it on camera, but my Bible is conveniently or strategically, however you want to look at it, marked with a bunch of little markers because there's a lot of places to go tonight. But we're going to look at a time in David's life where he showed undeniable devotion even in the midst of unbelievable suffering. A man after God's own heart, a person after God's own heart who's willing to do all of God's will. If we're looking at the example that David was, and we recognize he wasn't a perfect example, that is reserved for Jesus and Jesus alone. But he is one that God has made mention of, and we're paying attention to his life. And David shows that even in the midst of some unbelievable suffering, and I've made mention of it a number of weeks ago, David showed undeniable devotion to the Lord. And it's going to come out in a couple of unique ways, and I hope we see that. But David finds himself in this place of suffering because Saul, shortly after this David and Goliath moment, shortly after this victory that David accomplished for God and his people over the Philistines, David is in Saul's court, and Saul quickly turns on him. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, beginning in verse 1, we read this. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own. We will look at another moment, at another time. We'll look at the friendship that was developed between David and Jonathan. It's also a very interesting study. This is the beginning of it. In verse 2 of chapter 18, it says, "And Saul took him," speaking of David, "that day, and would not let him return to his father's house. And then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him, and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 5, really kind of setting up this difference in reaction that we're going to see from King Saul. Shortly after the battle of David, or the episode with David and Goliath, Saul's very own son Jonathan and David become what we would call close, united friends. People recognize, even Saul's servants recognize what a blessing this man, this young man David, was to the kingdom. And so you see, according to the author, this intent to say that while most people were recognizing the blessing that David was to the community, to the people of God, Saul, in contrast, does not. Verse 6 of chapter 18. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, and with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated. They sang, "Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s." Verse 8, here's where things start to get shifty. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. And he said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on. So you get this episode, Saul putting David in charge of the men of war, David having this incredible relationship with one of Saul's sons and the servants, and the people recognizing that this is a unique and special individual. They begin, even as that culture was accustomed to doing, they begin to sing little ditties, if you will, little songs talking about their heroes. And Saul was one of them. Saul has killed his 1,000. He has been victorious over thousands, but David over tens of thousands. They're just singing, and Saul immediately recognizes that the people are seeing that David is special. And Saul doesn't like it. He's upset by it. And it says here in these first 9 verses that Saul began to eyeball David from that time on, keep his eye on him, because Saul was more concerned about losing his own kingdom than he was about defending God's, right? But we knew that, didn't we? Because even in the episode with David and Goliath, that's what was going on. Saul refused to fight because he didn't want to lose his kingdom. He didn't want to lose his life. David, on the other hand, was more concerned about defending God's kingdom than he was his own life. And so you see this contrast between the two. The people loved David, but Saul feared him. Verse 10 of 1 Samuel chapter 18. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Now, a lot of people, they get a little sidetracked about this evil spirit from God coming upon Saul, and it's easy to think, well, Saul really didn't have any choice, did he? But what's really happening is this. In one sense, it's important to realize Saul is getting just exactly what he wants. Saul wants nothing but to take care of himself and do things according to his own will. And this evil spirit is not so much sent from God, but is permissioned by God to go and affect Saul. Continuing on. Day by day, David was playing his lyre. And Saul, verse 11, hurled a spear, for he thought, "I will pin David to the wall." But David evaded him twice. I don't know, like my imagination as I read the Bible, my mind is always working overtime, and I think in pictures and I read in pictures and I see these things, and You see this madman of a king who is completely and totally given over to himself, worried about losing his kingdom, has brought David in. There's a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of political maneuvering going on. He's brought this young hero, according to all the people, into his inner court. The music that he plays on the harp soothes Saul, right? But at the same time, he brings him in because it's important to keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, so to speak, would have been an old adage, right? So he brings David in. And at this moment, while he's playing, while he's literally serving the king picks up a spear and tries to kill David. We must be clear when the Bible says, I will pin David to the wall. Saul is not talking about some sort of spear-throwing trick shot. He's talking about murdering whom he considered to be a threat to his throne. The thing that always strikes me is that it says that David evaded him twice. That either speaks of David's naivety, that he just didn't get what was going on, or his graciousness, that he understood, wait, there's something strange going on here. And he continued to play. But he evaded Saul twice. Verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. So after this episode, Saul says, forget it, you're no longer going to be here. I'm going to send you out with the men of war, no doubt hoping he would become a casualty of war. And David had success in all of his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. He went out and he came in before them. So really what's happening, just so everybody knows, in the aftermath of giant killing, so to speak, you would expect that David would be recognized by not only the people, but also the king and the kingdom, that he would be recognized as a heroic figure who would find a prominent place. And on one hand, in one way he did, but on another hand, the king, who no doubt Saul was more concerned with himself and with what he might lose than what was to be gained, he tries to have David killed. When that's unsuccessful, he sends him out away from him, thinking that he might become a casualty of war, but he doesn't end up becoming a casualty. He becomes more victorious, and the people recognize it. And then Saul is only more and more frustrated. If we fast forward to 1 Samuel chapter 19, verse 1, I think we see an amazing verse. Not amazing as in great, but an amazingly sad scripture. It says in 1 Samuel chapter 19, verse 1, and Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. So David continues throughout chapter 18 to have these victories, to advance the kingdom for God's sake, right? And Saul's way of dealing with this is to try to convince everybody around him that David must be done away with. David must be done away with. Notice that it says that Saul tried to convince Jonathan and all his servants. Jonathan, David's best friend, who would have no doubt known where David was. In fact, if you keep reading the narrative, you'll find out shortly after this moment in chapter 19, Jonathan warns David. He says, be careful. My father's going to try to do away with you. It's an absolutely sad piece of scripture, because this scripture not only is a sad statement upon the king that Israel asked for. Remember way back when they asked for a king like all the other nations? And God spoke to Samuel the prophet and said, no, you give them a king, but you warn them that he will be like the kings from all the other nations. He'll be selfish. He will be ruthless, and he will take from you. He will not give to you. He will not bless you. In contrast to God himself as their king. This is exactly what Saul is doing. The second reason it's a sad piece of scripture is because it begins, chapter 19, verse 1, thus begins a 10-year process that David was running for his life from Saul. Scholars do the adjustments and they look at it, and it's about a 10-year period of time that from chapter 19 on, David for the next 10 years is literally running for his life. At this point, it's worth asking, well, what did David do to deserve this? I mean, David was just a shepherd boy minding his own business, actually minding his father's business, just doing a humble job as a no-name, not known shepherd boy. But God saw in this young man this heart for himself and began to raise him up to use him. And you would think that that would result in blessing upon blessing upon blessing, but it didn't. It only became more and more and more dangerous. So much so that for an entire decade, he had to live among the caves. He had to hide out in dry and weary lands. Have you ever been reading through the Psalms and you come across those Psalms in the Bible and you're like, oh, wait, we sing that song. We've sung a song about, as the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after thee, right? We sing that. But it's a whole different meaning if you recognize that there's a good chance that was being written by someone who was on the run for his life in a dry and weary land, in a hard and brutal place, where the very next day was not guaranteed. Because if the elements didn't end up getting you, the king and his servants were trying. This is a decade of disaster. And what do we see in David? We're going to get there and we're going to read some things. But one of the first things that we've got to recognize is, again, David showed undeniable devotion in the midst of this most unbelievable disaster. He's on the run for 10 years. The reason I think it's undeniable devotion, and it's devotion to the Lord, is because there were two episodes during this 10-year period that David had the opportunity to take Saul out, if that makes sense. David had the opportunity on two separate occasions to deal with it, to end his suffering and misery, to get rid of this king who was threatening his life, take his rightful place on the throne, and live happily ever after. And he did not do it. And what we'll see is he did not do it because of his respect and reverence for the Lord, and therefore the Lord's plans, purposes, and even people. This is why I say, from my own opinion, I think it's an unbelievable or undeniable devotion, because he is suffering for 10 years. He's on the run. He doesn't have a whole lot of anything going on for him. In fact, he is being treated like a criminal by the king in his court, and he still maintains in his life, in the midst of some of the most unimaginable suffering that I could ever think of. I remember in junior high, I said some bad words, some bad things about another guy in junior high behind his back. And word got out. I should have known better, right? The lesson to be learned from that day for me was don't say bad things about people. But word got out. And I remember word getting back to me that word had gotten out and that guy was going to take care of me. And I remember being on the run in junior high for an entire half a day at school. A half a day. 4 periods of ducking this hallway, ducking into this classroom, moving, shucking and jiving, because I knew that if that guy saw me and he got his hands on me, I was done for. I badmouthed the wrong guy. I had no business bad-mouthing a guy who was bigger than me, stronger than me, faster than me, and more experienced at fighting than me. I had never been in a fight. And word got out And then word got back to me, that word got out, that got back to me that this guy who was a good fighter was going to fight me. And I remember for an entire day being on the run. I got home to safety and I felt fine, but then I realized the next morning I got to go back. And I didn't know how I was going to do a whole nother day of this kind of suffering. Who can live like this? Well, thankfully, I didn't have to live like that for very long, because while we were waiting for school to start, I got a tap on my shoulder, and as soon as I turned around, that guy cold-cocked me right across the face, sent me sprawling back into the school. I bonked my head, fell down, tears were streaming out my eyes. I got rushed to the principal's office real quick. He did as well. We were forced to hug and say that we were cool, and it was over, literally over at that point. I learned another valuable lesson. If you're going to take a beating, just get it over with. David was on the run for 10 years. And at least twice, he had the opportunity to take matters into his own hands and end it. But he didn't, because of his devotion to God. If we turn to 1 Samuel chapter 24, we'll see that first moment. 1 Samuel chapter 24, the first few verses, we read that this. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi." David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. And then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went into the cave to relieve himself. This area of En-Gedi, there are streams running through it, but it's rocky, it is craggy, it is hot. There are caves all over the area. Saul goes into one of the caves to relieve himself, to use the bathroom, so to speak. And when the men of David, by this time, David's got some mighty men hanging out with him, helping him. And the men of David said to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as shall seem good to you." Then David arose and stealthily cut off the corner of Saul's robe. I don't know if you guys have no doubt heard these stories before. You've read these accounts before. As I read this, I think about it, and I try to picture in my mind this moment. Saul is in the deep, dark recesses of a cave going to the bathroom. And David sneaks in stealthily. And instead of doing away with the king, he just cuts off a corner of his robe without the king even knowing about it. And afterward, verse 5 of chapter 24, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord." And when he uses the term "my Lord" there, he's using a lowercase l, meaning to this one who rules over me, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went his way. Did you notice that? David goes in. His men have encouraged him and convinced him. All the suffering can be over now. All you got to do is go in there and deal with him. And he goes in there. And he doesn't deal with him. Instead, he just cuts off a corner of his robe. But even as he comes out, he's heartbroken by his actions, which to us seem trivial, right? Like at least he didn't do that. And he only did this. But to David, a man after God's own heart, his heart was struck with guilt and regret because he saw what he had done as lifting his hand against the one whom the Lord put in place. And who was he to come against him? This is unbelievable devotion. And note, it's unbelievable devotion to the Lord first and foremost. And not only does he devote himself to this, but he has such an influence on his men that he convinces them that they are not to go in and harm Saul either. And he explains to them because he is the Lord's anointed. Now, if you're us, you're like, wait a minute, this can't be. He's a terrible guy. This can't be right. When David is proclaiming, and we've got to get this, when he's proclaiming that he's not going to raise his hand against Saul because he's been anointed by the Lord for this time, for these reasons, David was also not only proclaiming a recognition of what God was doing, but he was also proclaiming that he was willing to trust God to deal and to do with everything according to his own will and according to his own plans. He was also trusting. Again, don't forget, who knows how long he's been suffering out in the wilderness without the quote-unquote comforts of home. And instead, he doesn't do it. In fact, in verse 8 of chapter 24, it says, Afterward, David also rose and went out of the cave and called after Saul. He said, "My Lord, my king." And then when King Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth, and he paid homage. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For by the fact that I cut it off, the corner of your robe, and did not kill you, you may now know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you." David's devotion is unreal. He's proclaiming, even to Saul's face, "I mean you no harm, and even though you want to kill me, I will place my trust in my God, not my own ability to deal with my circumstances." It's an unbelievable example. It's not the only one. There's another example. 1 Samuel chapter 26. Go ahead and turn over there. David again spares Saul. Again, David's told, I'll just recap the story really quickly. David again is told, like, hey, Saul's camping over there. So David gets some guys to go over there. And they see Saul camping, and he's able to sneak up on them. And one of David's men says, "Let me take him out. I'll hit him once," meaning it will only take me one moment. And David says no. And he does the same thing, comes back in chapter 26. He goes back and he calls to Saul and he said, "Look." Again, we read these chapters and they're really close together, but in reality, the events could have been years apart. But he says, "Look, you've been trying to kill me, and once again, I have spared you, and I have spared you because of the Lord." Look at 1 Samuel chapter 26, verse 17. Saul recognized David's voice as David was calling to him. "Is this your voice, my son David?" And David said, "Yes, it is my voice, my Lord and King." And he said, "Why does my Lord pursue after his servant? For what have I done? What evil is on my hands? Therefore, let my Lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is men, may they be cursed before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day, that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, 'Go serve other gods.' Now, therefore, let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to seek a single flea, like one who hunts a partridge in the mountains." David is essentially saying, look, you're still hunting an innocent guy. And though many have said that I should do this, I won't. And who am I really? I'm insignificant, is what David says. And Saul says, "I have sinned. Return my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly and have made a great mistake." And David answered and said, "Here is the spear, O king. Let one of the men come over and take it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. Behold, as your life was precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord, and may he deliver me out of all tribulation." Then Saul said to David, "Blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things and will succeed in them." So David went his way, and Saul returned to his place. Now, again, I wish at the end of that chapter, at the end of 26, I wish that the rest of the story would be, and there was no more enmity between Saul and David. But that's not the case. We know, according to the rest of the scriptures, that Saul would continue to chase David for quite some time. But again, it's worth noticing David's devotion. I will not take matters into my own hands. I will entrust my life to my Lord. It's worth noticing that not just on one occasion, but on two. One occasion, you could say, well, David tried to do a good thing, but, once again, if he had the opportunity again, but another occasion comes up and he is still showing a greater devotion to the Lord than he is to taking matters into his own hands. He's still depending and trusting in the Lord. I just think it's an unbelievably great example for us. I know many people, even in the days that we're living through, are fed up and frustrated with their circumstances. I myself have gotten the same way over this or that. I don't know about you guys, but all of us have probably at one time or another have gotten fed up with what can feel like unfair suffering in the midst of everything that's going on. But a friend today mentioned that maybe it's not unfair suffering, maybe it's just a light and momentary affliction, right? Maybe it's a light and momentary inconvenience. But I know this, every single time I get frustrated, I'm tempted to take matters into my own hands. And that's been my deal my whole life. If times get tough, the tough get going, and I take matters into my own hands. But what I've learned over the last 30 years of trying to do my best to be faithful to the Lord, walk with the Lord, be devoted to the Lord, I keep learning more and more and more that when I take matters into my own hands and deal with my own circumstances the way I think makes sense, they never go all that well. But when I hold back, even just like David, and try to trust the Lord, when I trust that the Lord would help me, that I trust that the Lord will protect me, when I trust that the Lord will sustain me, then through that process, there's blessing upon blessing. There's a blessing of being able to go through a process with no regrets, right? I don't have anything to regret. I don't have to regret selfishness. I don't have to regret anything that I've done wrong because I've stepped back and trust the Lord. But there's also the blessing of having my faith built because I know, even as we read, the Lord is faithful in those things. I brought up three things. David trusted, just like we should, that the Lord would help him. David trusted that the Lord would protect him. And David believed that the Lord would sustain him. How do we know? Well, this is the beauty about studying the life of David, because not only do we get the narrative stories, but we also get things that David himself wrote down. David, in Psalm chapter 40, verse 1, he said these words, verses 1 through 5. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog, and he set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Blessed is the man, blessed is the person who makes the Lord his trust, who does not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after a lie. You have multiplied, O Lord my God, your wondrous deeds and your thoughts towards us. None can compare with you. I will proclaim and tell of them, yet they are more than what can be told. David believed, according to what he wrote in Psalm 40, he believed that the Lord would help him. And so he says that he waited patiently for the Lord. He waited patiently for the Lord. And he goes on and he says, and the Lord inclined and heard his cry and did wondrous deeds, blessed him upon blessing upon blessing. And here's the beauty of that kind of waiting, the kind of faithful waiting upon the Lord, the refusal to take matters into our own hands. In other words, the willingness to let go and let God, right? That's kind of what we're talking about. The beauty is we may end up just like David, with songs to sing, stories to tell, lessons that have been learned, discipleship that has been strengthened, and faith that is growing. This is what waiting on the Lord does for us. You see, sometimes we feel like waiting is doing nothing. Waiting is not doing nothing. Waiting on the Lord is doing a lot, because the very waiting itself requires that we continue to trust and we continue to place our faith in him. And just like we've learned all throughout our own experiences, and even as the Bible communicates, those who wait on the Lord are not sorry. Those who wait on the Lord have songs to sing, stories to tell, a testimony to be lived out, a testimony to talk about, something to share with others. And did you notice that David said, I'll sing this new song and I'll tell people of the wondrous things that God has done. Many will see, many will hear, many will see what I say and put their trust in the Lord. When we wait on the Lord, even as David waited on the Lord, it opens us up to this, once again, reality that we need to be reminded of, that what's happening in our lives is way more than just us. There's a lot going on all around us. And there's a lot going on all around us that maybe, just maybe, God wants us to be involved in for the sake of someone else's faith. And if we wait on him and take our hands, refuse to manhandle our messes, and instead allow the Lord to be mighty even in the middle of them, and we trust him, and we wait on him, and we wait for his help, man, we will have stories to tell. We will have songs to sing. We will have a testimony to cry and shout from the rooftops. And man, I pray and I dearly desire that as we do that as individuals and as a church, that many will see and fear and put their trust in him. Many will recognize God's almightiness and bend the knee and bow their heads in humble reverence to him. See, David waited on the Lord, but David also believed that the Lord would not just help him, but actually protect him. In Psalm 59, verses 1 through 9, we read some more words about what David said. It says this, "Deliver me from my enemies, O my God." You can imagine that David, during this 10 years of being on the run for his life, you can imagine that there was moment after moment after moment where he was just alone with his own thoughts, alone with his own struggles, alone with his own frustrations. And what does he do? He cries out to the Lord. He says, "Deliver me from my enemies, O my God. Protect me from those who rise up against me. Deliver me from those who work evil, and save me from bloodthirsty men. For behold, they lie in wait for my life. Fierce men stir up strife against me. For no transgression or sin of mine, O Lord, no fault of mine, they run and make ready. Awake, come to meet me and see. You, Lord God of hosts, are God of Israel. Rouse yourself to punish all the nations. Spare none of those who treacherously plot evil. Each evening they come back, howling like dogs and prowling about the city. They are bellowing with their mouths, with swords in their lips, for who they think will hear us. But you, O Lord, laugh at them. You hold all the nations in derision. O my strength, I will watch for you, O God, are my fortress. He goes on in verse 10, he says, my God, in his steadfast love, will meet me. God will let me look in triumph on my enemies. David not only believed that the Lord would help him, but he believed that God would actually protect him. And so not only did he wait on the Lord, but he watched for the Lord. And I think that's a great reminder for us. He kept, when I say that he watched for the Lord, the sense is this, his head, he was willing to let the eyes of his heart, mind, and soul look above the muck and the mire and the fray, so that he could see the Lord's plans and the Lord's purposes and what the Lord was doing. Don't forget that much had been said to David by Samuel about what David would do. And in the quietness of suffering, in the loneliness of frustration, he cried out to the Lord to protect him. And he was willing to not only wait, but to watch. And I think, again, even for us, that's a good thing. I know for many, even though we would hear, hey, we need to, especially in our days, keep our eyes on the Lord. Not many of us would actually argue with that, right? I'm hoping that all of us would say, yeah, that's a really important thing for us. But how many of us are distracted by this news story or by that Facebook post or by that thing that we heard from that neighbor? It is so easy in the time we live to kind of stop watching for the Lord and watch out for this, that, or the other. And I want to encourage us, let's be a people who by faith are watching out for the Lord. Not only did David believe that the Lord would help him and protect him, but he also believed that God would sustain him. Sustain him. In Psalm 63, verses 1 through 8, David wrote these words. He said, "O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water." Now again, if you had ever been over to the area where they believed that David was this wilderness, this desert area where he was on the hideout or on the run from Saul, and it is a dry and weary, hot land. I think one day I was over there and it was 109 at like 9 in the morning, hot land. I know it's hot here. What'd you say? It was like 94 on the way in now. It's hot, but it was hot. David continues, he says, "So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory. Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live. In your name I will lift up my hands." Don't forget, he's in a dry and weary land, and he's still saying, for God's steadfast love is better than life. "So I will bless you as long as I live. In your name I will lift up my hands. My soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips when I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night. For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. My soul clings to you. Your right hand upholds me." David believed that God would sustain him. And so he clung. He was willing to cling to the reality, to the presence of God. Again, a fantastic lesson for you and I. If we take nothing out of this, we should be reminded that even in the midst of any and every circumstance, we as God's people should show great devotion. That we should, just as David did, believe that God would help us, believe that God would protect us, and believe that God would sustain us. And so we wait on him, watch for him, and cling to him. But I think it's also worth noting that David's belief is what affected his behavior. David's belief affected his behavior. In each one of those Psalms, Psalm 40, Psalm 59, Psalm 63, David first proclaimed his belief, and then he proclaimed his behavior. "This is what I believe about you, God, so I will wait on you. This is what I believe about you, God, so I will watch for you. This is what I believe about you, God, so I will cling to you." I think for us, especially during the days in which we're living, it's important to remember and to recognize and reacquaint ourselves with what we really believe about God, and then allow that to affect our behavior, that we might be a people who wait on the Lord, who watch for the Lord, and ultimately cling to the Lord.